Hello. Tonight I'll be reading from the book Phantasms of the Living, Volume 2, which was put out in 1886 by the Society for Psychical Research. And that organization was formed in 1882 in London, and it still exists today. They're still going strong all these years later. And this is a book that contains a huge amount of evidence for psychic phenomena of all kinds, and is close to 770 pages. I certainly won't be reading all of that. I don't have the energy, and it's 2 volumes, so these people really went all in on the data collection. But what I will do is read from a chapter about dreams, which seem to have psychic qualities. I think it's a good topic. Dreams are always mysterious. And we're going to hear about some very weird ones in this chapter, so let's get started. Chapter 3, Dreams. The cases to be now presented are supplementary to those of Volume 1, Chapter 8, and will be arranged as far as possible in similar groups. From Mr. A. Watts, 19 Shine Walk, Chelsea, Southwest, 1883. When I was a young child, about the year 1830, my father had been called out of town by business, and my mother took me into her room to sleep. She awoke in the middle of the night, or early morning, out of a dream in which it had appeared to her that the servant was attempting to murder her with a knife. I had awakened at the same time, and was sobbing in my crib by her bedside. Upon her inquiring what was amiss with me, I replied that I had dreamt that John was murdering her with a knife. She always affirmed that, to the best of her knowledge, I had at that time never heard the word murder. She rang up the servants and wrote immediately to her husband, who returned to town at once and discharged the man without more ado. My mother had had no previous antipathy to the man, rather the contrary, for he was a very clever and handy servant and had been a sailor. We had never heard then, nor did we hear subsequently, anything to his disadvantage. And a note in brackets, this evidence cannot rank as better than second-hand. The following letter appeared in The Nation for November 26, 1885. Sir, I have been much interested in the cases of telepathy reported in The Nation, and give the following, which happened here last week. Mrs. F. dreamed her watch was broken, and was greatly afflicted to see it all in pieces, and in her distress awoke. Feeling very ill, she awakened her husband to go for a physician. His first words on awaking were, "Who broke your watch?" M.E.W., Dover, New Hampshire, November 16th, 1885. The writer of this letter, Dr. Mary E. Webb, was applied to for details, and wrote to us as follows. 37 Trowbridge Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA. February 3rd, 1886. Near midnight, Mrs. Flynn dreamed her watch was broken. She saw the crystal and all the works crushed to fragments. She awoke in some pain and aroused her husband from a sound sleep, and his first words, according to her report, were, "Who broke your watch? How did your watch get broken?" etc. Then she told me she laughed in spite of the pain, and told him that was just what she had dreamed before the pain had awakened her. Then they found their dreams coincided exactly as to the manner in which the watch was broken, and that the watch was got and examined, to make sure it was not as they had dreamed. This they related to me the same night, as something worth the telling. They thought it singular and interesting. I asked them what they had said about the watch before going to bed, and they said nothing, that they had not thought of it at all. Mary E. Webb. In the next 3 cases, the telepathic influence of a distant agent seems to be involved, and may have acted independently on the dreamers. Confer Case 127 and see Chapter 12, Section 2. Or one dreamer so influenced may have infected the others. From the Reverend P.T. Drayton, Undercliff, Portishead, January 1884. When a child in the West Indies, there was an old African woman who had great attractions for me. She was full of ghost stories, and, though a Christian, had not, I fear, discarded obeah ideas altogether. Sometimes she would come in to show us how she would look dressed in her grave clothes, which she kept by her, and we would make merry over it. Well, several years afterwards, I saw in my dreams her figure by my bedside in full grave costume. It was very vivid, and I awoke with a determination that I would eat no more late suppers. At breakfast next morning, my sister told us that she had had much the same dream, but as she had never seen the old woman masquerading in her shroud, as I had, it made more impression. Sometime afterwards, we had a letter from W.I. mentioning the old woman's death on the day on which these dreams occurred. This occurred some 45 years ago, and I cannot be responsible for its strict accuracy. P.T. Drayton. In answer to inquiries, Mr. Drayton says, "Taking your queries seriatim, I would reply first that my sister has been dead over 30 years. Second, that my sister and self had the dream on the same night, without having been either talking or thinking of the old woman. Third, that, to the best of my recollection, the tidings of the old woman's death arrived shortly after." A lady, a connection of Mr. Drayton's, through whom we procured this narrative, says, all the family knew of these dreams. From Fynes Morrison's Itinerary, London 1617, Part 1, Chapter 2, page 19. I may lawfully swear that which my kinsmen have heard witnessed by my brother Henry whilst he lived, that in my youth at Cambridge I had the like dream of my mother's death, where, my brother Henry lying with me early in the morning, I dreamed that my mother passed by with sad countenance, and told me that she could not come to my commencement, I being within 5 months to proceed Master of Arts, and she having promised at that time to come to Cambridge. And when I related this dream to my brother, both of us awaking together in a sweat, he protested to me that he had dreamed the very same, and when he had not the least knowledge of our mother's sickness, neither in our youthful affections were in any way affected by the strangeness of this dream, yet the next carrier brought us word of our mother's death. From Mr. Swithenbank, Ormley, Mowbray Road, Upper Norwood, Southeast, May 26, 1883. During the Peninsular War, my father and his 2 brothers, William and John, were quartered at Dover. They were natives of Bradford, and had there living their father, mother, and the rest of their family. On one special night, my father had a dream that his mother was dead. The dream was most vivid, and in his waking moments the dream kept continually recurring to him, and he could not shake off the impression of sadness it brought upon him. The other brothers each slept at different parts of the garrison, and they only met with each other on parade. The morning following the dream, and after the parade was over, my father ran hurriedly on to meet his brothers, and as he approached them, they each appeared as anxious to meet him as he was to meet them. In a tone of breathless anxiety, my father said, "Oh, William, I have had a queer dream." "So have I," replied his brother, when, to the astonishment of both, the other brother, John, said, "I have had a queer dream as well. I dreamt that my mother was dead." "So did I," said each of the other brothers. It was true that each brother dreamt during the same night that their mother was dead, and it is equally true that in the course of a few days, for the posts then were seldom for such long distances, they heard from home that during the night of their dream, their mother, who had had no previous illness of which her sons knew anything, had quietly passed away. George Edwin Swithenbank. In answer to inquiries, Mr. Swithenbank adds, I heard it over and over again from my father and the two brothers concerned. A sister of Mr. Swithenbank's corroborates as follows. Farnley near Leeds, October 20th, 1883. I fully confirmed this statement as the only surviving daughter of the younger of the three brothers. The last time I saw my Uncle William, shortly before my father's death, he specially named the circumstance to me, and I had heard it from my early infancy repeatedly from the lips of my father and his other brothers. R. M. Hudson, née Swithenbank. Next comes a group in which some thought on the part of a waking agent seems to have been represented in the dream. The following case strongly recalls number 149, where the percipient seemed to catch the idea of a scene about which the agent was silently reading. From Miss Julia Wedgwood, 31, Queen Anne Street, West, March 1886. My dream was that I was hurrying along the street somehow in company with a little girl of about 10, who was telling me of her life in Florence, where she had been brought up. I was listening to her with great interest, and I remember in my dream being surprised that I could feel interest in the conversation of a child of that age. One odd thing was that she was telling me about building, and that we wandered into some grand new structure where I had never been before. In the morning, I took up the novel Marian had been reading before she went to bed, sitting close to me. I will copy the passages which made me feel that her interest in the book must somehow have been transferred to my mind. My building was not a cathedral, and what the child said about building had the absurdity of a dream, so my dream was not exact. The little girl in the novel has been brought up in Florence. Julia Wedgwood. The extracts from a novel called Clarissa's Tangled Web are as follows. Thus wandering, she passed to the east end of the north aisle, much secluded from view by the back of the great organ and the pulpit, and so alone had she felt that she started when she saw a little girl seated on a stone step, the first of three leading up to an old oaken door filling a low, narrow doorway in the wall. She noticed, too, that the little girl looked towards her and closed her book, and now appeared rather to invite than to deprecate conversation. So she drew nearer, and said in the peculiarly pleasant voice which generally prepossessed strangers and not seldom drew forth unexpected confidences, "You enjoy, my dear, being in this cathedral?" Irene rose. "Yes, ma'am," she said, "I do. I have seen many much finer cathedrals and churches, having been brought up in Florence. But this is a good building in many respects, and I do like being here very much." Mrs. Wetherill felt rather amused by the air of experienced judgments and critical discernment assumed by this very young connoisseur, but she said pleasantly, "You know the building much more familiarly than I do, I have no doubt." "I have read about it, ma'am, and have observed for myself," Irene said, quite willing to impart information and give her own impressions. "You see the vaulting of the roof, how it is filled in and held up by those arches, so many intersections and changing lines. That is quite a unique arrangement, but I think it is beautiful. And then, ma'am, you see that the height of the vaulting in the two side aisles and the middle aisle is exactly the same," etc. In reply to inquiries, Miss Wedgwood says, "I am quite sure that Marian Hughes read not a word aloud and did not mention to me any of the circumstances which reproduced themselves with the grotesque triviality of such things in my dream, and that I did not know anything of the contents of the book. It was one of a number sent me to review. I leave it with you with the relevant passages marked, and Marian being very unwell, I advised her to look through the heap instead of doing anything else. She sat by me all the evening reading this novel. I was busy with something else, and we hardly exchanged a word. We went to bed at the same time, and I had a vivid dream of meeting two children in the street — there is only one in the book — and getting into a conversation with the girl about building. The only sentence which remains with me is the absurd one. What? Don't you know that all the heart of oak used in England comes from Florence? Where she told me she had lived all her life. I had a vivid sense in my dream of the intelligence and rare knowledge of the little girl, and when I opened the book at page 38, it came to me with an almost startling sense of familiarity. I think I mentioned that I was wandering with my little girl in a curious new building and noticed the ceiling, but it was not a cathedral, so that again was only partly like. But it was, I remember, a curiously low roof. There was a sense of rather dramatic interest in the little girl which the story reproduces, and which is very rare in dreams, but I can remember no words to help it out. I think the child was 10, but the sense of premature cleverness and of surprise at myself in being interested in a child's talk about buildings is what remains with me. Miss Wedgwood adds, the dream corresponded with her, Marion's, inaccurate recollection of the fiction more than with the fiction itself. She fancied that the incident was supposed to occur as in my dream, a grown person walking with a little girl in the street. It is one of several faint coincidences of the same kind, but most are so uninteresting that we forget them. Another little case of thought reading between us may have interest for you. I should premise that M.H. is my most intimate friend as well as my maid, copies all my writings for me, and shares all my interests. In the year 1880, I was troubled by some circumstances which I carefully concealed from her. I thought that some actions of mine might have caused annoyance to a friend long dead if he had been still among us, and the doubt stirred up much speculation in my head as to the possible feeling in those who are gone. On the morning after I had been dwelling on this, which I did with a sense of vivid anxiety, M.H. said to me, "Oh, I had such a strange dream last night. I thought I saw Mr. A come alive in his picture in the wall, and stand out of the picture and look down with sorrow and grief as if he were much hurt." I felt she had exactly read my anxious feelings, all sign of which had been carefully concealed from her. She had never seen the picture, which was very familiar to me. From Mrs. Hunter, 2 Victoria Crescent, St. Heliers, Jersey, January 8th, 1884. The following happened in India some 13 years ago. My second daughter had been with me while I was preparing for bed one night. Our talk was merry and only gossip. At last she left me for her own room. In the middle of the night I awoke in an agony of grief and sat up in bed, sobbing and trembling. In vain I reasoned and tried to believe it was only a dream. For a time I could not, it was so real. My dream was that a cobra di capello had bitten my daughter, and she raised a blanched, pinched face to mine and said, "Must I die, Mama?" And I had replied in agony, "You must, darling." Next morning, my dream hardly remembered, I was dressing when she, as usual, came to me. Her first words were, "Oh, Mama, I had such a horrid feeling last night while I was undressing. I felt sure there was a snake in my room, and had such a hunt before I got into bed. Indeed, I feel sure the wretch is there still, and I have ordered the Hamel, male housemaid, to turn my bathroom upside down. It was a horrid feeling." No snake was ever seen in her room. Even in those days, before one had heard of thought transference, I explained it to myself in some such way, viz., that her waking terror had communicated itself to me in sleep and caused my dream. H. E. Hunter. In answer to inquiries, Mrs. Hunter adds, "No, we never had dreams, nor apprehensions, nor talks about snakes. At hill stations where they may be seen, we have, of course, talked of them, glad to have any subject for talk, but at the time of my dream we were living in a large house close to the sea, and where snakes were almost unknown. As to the seeming discrepancy in time, it can be removed in this way. I got into bed directly she left me, and in India, when in health, I generally went to sleep at once. She was given to sit up reading, and it was while undressing the panic began. Then followed the hunt, and we may feel sure that even after she got into bed, sleep might not come all at once. My feeling when I awoke was as if it were the middle of the night, but it might really have been only an hour or two. I never looked at the time. And another note in brackets, we of course cannot assume that the coincidence was exact. From Mrs. Sibley, 6 Radipole Road, Fulham, Southwest. January 26, 1884. The following occurred about May 1859. I believed my son to be away in the Mediterranean, and I had no reason to believe he would come home for a year or two, when one night I dreamt that I had a letter, and all that was written on it and inside it was Woolwich, Woolwich, Woolwich. I awoke with the belief that I must be going to hear from him. It was then about 6:30. I could not sleep any more, and when I heard the postman's knock at the door, I sent immediately for the letters. Only one was brought to me, and that had for its postmark Woolwich Stockyard, and it was from my son, telling me of the safe arrival the night before of the ship he was on. My son was in the Navy, and I am perfectly certain that the idea of his speedy return had never crossed my mind. For aught I knew, he might be several years away. This dream is unique in my experience, in the strength of the conviction it produced that it must correspond with reality. I mentioned this dream immediately on waking to a daughter, since deceased, who was sleeping with me, Catherine Sibley. The following corroboration is from the wife of the present writer, a younger daughter of Mrs. Sibley's. 26 Montpelier Square, Southwest. January 26, 1884. I remember the news of this incident spreading through the house before breakfast, and our rushing to my mother's room, when we were shown the letter and told the dream. Kate S. Gurney. From Mr. E. C. Trevelyan, 3 Petersham Terrace, Southwest, February 2nd, 1884. The following occurrence took place some 12 or 14 years ago. I was unmarried, and my house in Somerset had no establishment in it, merely an old housekeeper and a maidservant. I lived more than half the year in chambers in London, and when I went alone down to the country, I never gave notice of my coming. On the day in question, I walked up from the station, leaving my luggage to follow, and rang, as usual, at the side door. The maidservant unlocked and opened it, paused a moment, while a look of terror came over her face, and fled in much confusion. I walked in slowly, and instead of turning towards my study, marched straight to the servants' hall. The old housekeeper was by the fire, and as I approached her, walking up one side of the long table, she rushed down the other and out of the room. I retreated to my study, and in about half an hour rang the bell. The old woman was still a little shaky, but was able to explain that the two had so entirely made up their minds that I was dead, that on my appearance just now they had taken me for my ghost. The maidservant had dreamed some 10 days before that I was out shooting, that my gun had burst, and that I had been killed on the spot. They had mentioned this to several people, among them to the clergyman and to my agent, but without producing much effect. The girl had been so positive that she, the old woman, had come to feel equally sure of my death. Now, on the day of the dream, it is a fact that my gun had burst. That is, it had gone in two at the breech, and no harm had been done. It was at a country house in Oxfordshire, and I was using sawdust powder, then a new invention, and several accidents had occurred with it about that time, and some had been mentioned in the newspapers. This, however, I well recollect. My host and I, then and there, standing among the beaters, decided that the accident should not be mentioned, and we looked regularly and found no notice of it in the local or London papers. Nor could I find out that any mention of it had been seen in any of the Somerset local papers, though it was chiefly by inquiry and not by myself examining the files that I went to work. I have quite lost sight of the servant maid. The old woman was still in existence in the neighborhood some months ago. E.C. Trevelyan. From Miss Augusta Gould, now Mrs. Temple and resident in India. Sunnybank, Ealing Dean, West. December 19th, 1883. When my brother was in Glasgow, I told his son I had had a curious dream of an unwieldy chair coming to me as a present from his father. As I was only residing in his house, I had no idea or need of receiving a chair. The next post brought me a letter from him, saying he had bought me such a curious American revolving chair, which was unwieldy when it came, the heavy pedestal and legs giving us difficulty in moving it from one place to another. I have had other curious unexpected events occur after dreams foreshadowing them, but will not burden you with more particulars. Surely the affair of the chair was a curious case of rapport between my brother's spirit and mine, as he never retired to rest till very late, and then was sleepless. He might have been thinking of his present to me when I was dreaming of it. Augusta Gould. In answer to inquiries, Miss Gould added, I send my nephew's corroboration of the dream as to the chair. I may mention that my nephew is 26 years old and clear in memory usually, but he forgets that my brother was in Glasgow at the time. As to one of your questions, I dream always in sleep, either by day or night. Whenever I wake, a dream is broken into, so I often dream things which do not come to pass, though often a foreshadowing of events does come to be realized. The following is from a postcard written to Miss Gould by her nephew from 6 Ellison Place, Newcastle-on-Tyne, and forwarded to us. January 2nd, 1884. I remember perfectly about the chair. It was one time when my father was south that you had the dream, and when he came back he brought the chair with him. I have told several people about the circumstance. Alex G. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here for the night. This is a very long chapter, and man, we have a long way to go. There's a lot of words per page also. These are huge pages. So this may turn into another 2-parter or 3-parter. We'll see. But that was plenty of content for now, I think. And we've got lots to think about. I guess the lesson to take away from this is to pay attention to your dreams. You never know when they're going to be important. Even a dream about a chair. So, with that, thanks for listening, and have a good night.